In the late summer of 1962, while American engineers were wiring computers that filled entire rooms and test pilots were riding rockets into the upper atmosphere, an 18-year-old bricklayer in East Berlin was staring at a concrete wall and wondering if he would ever be allowed to cross his own city again. On one side of that wall, American tanks, radios, cameras, and helicopters watched every movement along the border in real time. On the other side, Soviet-designed border guards with carbines and floodlights tried to hold back not just a few desperate people, but an entire age of information, mobility, and technology that was clearly leaving them behind. That young bricklayer's name was Peter Fechter. He was born in 1944, in the ruins of a Germany that had been bombed flat, divided up, and put under the supervision of 4 victorious powers. By the time he was old enough to understand the world around him, there were already 2 Germanys, 2 Berlins, and 2 futures. One open to the American-led world of consumer goods, cars, television, and soon spaceflight, and another locked inside the Soviet system, where even crossing the street into another sector could be considered a political act. If you grew up in East Berlin in the 1950s, like Peter did, you could see the difference with your own eyes. You could stand on a street corner and look across to the western sectors and watch American cars drive past shiny shop windows. You could see advertising billboards, neon signs, people carrying radios and cameras, even tourists with color film, and know that you lived in the half of the city where those things were either scarce or completely out of reach. Peter's family was divided by that line. His sister Lilo lived in the West, in that different Berlin that listened to American music and tuned in to broadcasts carried over powerful Western transmitters. Peter stayed in the East, learning a trade as a bricklayer, building the very kind of structures that the regime used to keep people like him from leaving. At first, the border in Berlin was just a political idea on a map. People could still cross from one sector to another with relative ease, and thousands did every day, commuting to work, visiting relatives, or just going to see a movie in a different part of town. But for the leaders in Moscow and East Berlin, that open city was a problem because it was also a daily advertisement for what American industry and Western capitalism were capable of producing. By 1961, more than 2.5 million people had left the East for the West, many of them young, educated, and badly needed. They walked through Berlin train stations carrying suitcases, took the subway, boarded flights out of West Berlin's Tegel and Tempelhof airports, and vanished into a world of opportunity advertised on American posters and in glossy Western magazines. Soviet and East German officials understood that every one of those departures was a vote of no confidence in their system and a compliment to the American-led world they were trying to compete with. So, in the early hours of August 13, 1961, they tried to solve the problem with barbed wire, concrete, and guns. They rolled out trucks, unspooled wire, and started building the structure the world would come to know as the Berlin Wall. Overnight, tram lines were cut, streets were blocked, subway lines were sealed, and families were divided by soldiers in Soviet-pattern uniforms, following orders that had come down after long discussions in Moscow. On the western side, American soldiers woke up to find themselves staring at something new. They had seen barbed wire before. They had fought behind hedgerows and in ruined European cities during World War II, but this was different. This was the permanent industrial face of the Cold War, a permanent border between 2 worlds, one run by a government that trusted its citizens to leave and return, and another that had decided it needed machine gun nests and minefields to keep its own people inside. For almost a year, Peter watched that border harden. He saw the wire turn into concrete, the wooden barriers turn into slabs, the informal checkpoints transform into towers equipped with searchlights, optical sights, and automatic weapons. Each new upgrade on the eastern side was meant to stop people. Each new American radio tower or television relay on the western side was meant to reach them anyway. By 1962, the contrast could not have been clearer. On one side, the United States, testing rocket engines, deploying early computers, and landing high-altitude U-2 spy planes that could photograph entire cities in a single pass. On the other, a Soviet bloc whose most famous piece of border technology was a tripwire connected to a Kalashnikov pointed at the backs of its own citizens. Peter was not a politician, he was not an engineer or a scientist, he did not read policy papers or classified memos. He was a teenager who wanted to live in a place where he could travel, visit his sister, and build something more than walls. He and his friend, a coworker named Helmut Kulbeck, began to talk quietly about leaving. Like many young East Berliners, they had heard stories about successful escapes, people who crawled through sewers, piloted home-built hot air balloons, or rammed trucks through barriers. Some of those stories were true, some were exaggerations. All of them carried the same message, that the desire to get to the free half of the city was stronger than the threat of Soviet-backed guns. Peter and Helmut didn't have a truck or a balloon. What they had was their own courage, a simple plan, and a target, a stretch of the border along Zimmerstrasse, near the most famous crossing point of the entire Cold War, Checkpoint Charlie. On Western maps, that was a place where American military police checked documents, where diplomats passed, where news cameras were always rolling. On Eastern maps, it was a tightly controlled borderline guarded by men with orders to shoot. The irony was brutal. The place where American cameras and microphones were most concentrated, where Western reporters recorded every update in crisp audio and clear images, was also the place where an East German teenager decided to take the ultimate risk. Peter and Helmut watched the guards' routines, noted where the towers stood, and timed the patrols. They convinced themselves that they had a chance. August 17, 1962 was warm in Berlin. In the West, people were out shopping, driving American and German cars past cafes and cinemas. In the East, Peter went to work, laying bricks in a city that his own government had decided needed to be fenced in. At some point after 2 in the afternoon, he and Helmut slipped away, moving toward the borderline they had studied. They approached the inner barrier, knowing that between them and the American sector were several obstacles: a wall or fence facing the east, a so-called death strip of open ground, and finally the higher outer wall that faced West Berlin. Behind that outer wall, in Kreuzberg, there were shops selling Western goods, streets with American military jeeps, and a city plugged into a global network of trade, television, and information that stretched across the Atlantic. Peter and Helmut made their move. They climbed, dropped down into the restricted zone, and sprinted across the death strip toward the final wall. For a moment, it seemed like they might make it. They were young, fit, and motivated. They had human legs and lungs against concrete and barbed wire. But above them, in the towers and along the line, the technology of repression was already locked in place. Spotters saw movement. Guards grabbed their carbines. Orders that had been drilled into them for months snapped into action. Stop escapees by any means necessary. Shots rang out. Helmut managed to climb, grab the top of the wall, and haul himself over the barbed wire into the western sector. He crashed down on the other side, battered but alive, into a world where American military medics, police radios, and Western ambulances were only seconds away. Peter was not so lucky. He reached the wall, started to climb, and then a bullet caught him in the hip and pelvis, tearing through arteries and organs. He screamed and fell backward into the death strip, landing in the sand and dirt on the eastern side, just meters away from freedom. The same border that American cameras and microphones were documenting from one side had just become the place where an unarmed teenager lay bleeding on the other. People in West Berlin heard his screams almost immediately. Office workers, pedestrians, tourists, and police officers rushed to the wall. American soldiers stationed near Checkpoint Charlie, with radios linked to command posts and armored vehicles, looked across and saw a single human being in agony at the foot of a Soviet-backed barrier. Peter cried out for help, in German, to anyone who could hear him. He held his hands to his wound, tried to crawl, and left dark streaks of blood in the dust beneath the concrete. Everyone could see him. No one was allowed to reach him. On the western side, Berlin police and American personnel faced an impossible order. Their radios worked. Their medics were trained. They had vehicles, stretchers, bandages, and the full modern emergency response of a Western city at their disposal. But the line on the map, backed by Soviet power, meant that stepping into that strip of sand could be seen as an armed incursion into East German territory. So they did what they could without crossing. They shouted, asking for his name. They pushed ladders up against the wall, climbed as high as they dared, and threw bandages and medical kits over the concrete, hoping he could pull himself together enough to stop the bleeding. But Peter was too badly hurt and too far gone. On the eastern side, the guards who had fired pulled back from the open strip, taking cover. Later, they would claim that they felt threatened by the number of Western police and Americans pointing weapons and binoculars in their direction. In reality, everyone on that border that day knew that this was not a battle between armies. It was a test of how far a government would go to prevent one unarmed teenager from joining the world on the other side. Minutes dragged by. 5 minutes. 10. 15. The crowd in West Berlin grew, filling the sidewalks and windows. Some people shouted murderers at the Eastern Guards. Others stood in stunned silence, watching a human life ebb away in a place where no one was supposed to die. Cameras clicked. Television crews filmed. Somewhere, in an American living room weeks later, someone would watch the footage and see exactly what the Cold War looked like when you stripped away speeches and statistics. A bleeding boy at the foot of a wall, and a line of well-armed men too afraid of their own orders to help him. For roughly 50 minutes, Peter lay there, his cries growing weaker as his body lost blood. By the time East German border troops finally moved in, tossing smoke grenades to obscure the view from Western cameras, the outcome was almost certain. They lifted his limp body onto a stretcher and carried him away, out of sight. Officially, he was taken to East Berlin Hospital, where doctors pronounced him dead. Forensic experts later concluded that the damage to his pelvis, arteries, and internal organs meant that his chances of survival had been very low from the moment he was hit. But those same experts also understood why the world was outraged. It was not just that Peter had been shot. It was that he had been left to die in public, at the edge of a city that had all the technology necessary to save him on one side and all the firepower necessary to kill him on the other. News of his death spread quickly. In West Berlin, people flooded the area near Checkpoint Charlie, bringing flowers and signs, placing candles against the wall itself. Someone erected a simple wooden cross marked with his name on the western side of the border, right where he had fallen on the eastern side. Peter was buried under the eyes of the secret police, the Stasi, who recorded who came to his funeral and who dared to leave flowers. His family lived with both grief and surveillance, punished quietly for the fact that their son's death had become an international symbol. His sister, in the West, spent years speaking publicly about him, turning her personal tragedy into a warning to anyone tempted to see the Cold War only as an abstract contest between nuclear arsenals and economic statistics. Meanwhile, his cross remained. In West Berlin, the place where he fell became a stop on what you might call a pilgrimage route of freedom. Politicians, including American presidents and West German chancellors, visited the wall, and gestures like placing wreaths there became part of the ritual of Cold War statecraft. They stood in front of concrete poured under Soviet supervision and spoke into microphones built by Western companies, sending signals around the world. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989, it was not because one person tried to escape. It was because millions of people, over decades, refused to accept that they should live behind barbed wire while the rest of the world moved forward. But stories like Peter's had prepared the ground. They had shown, in vivid detail, what that wall actually meant. After reunification, the new German authorities opened investigations into deaths at the wall, including Peter's. For the first time, prosecutors could access border guard files and Stasi archives. They pieced together who had been on duty that day, what orders had been given, and how many shots had been fired. In 1997, two former East German border guards, Rolf Friedrich and Erich Schreiber, stood in a united German courtroom and faced charges related to Peter's killing. They admitted that they had fired, insisted that they had only been following orders, and said they were sorry. The court, working under the principle that individual responsibility still matters even in a dictatorship, convicted them of manslaughter and gave them suspended sentences. Some people thought the sentences were too light. Others argued that the real responsibility lay with the higher-ups in the East German and Soviet systems, who had written the rules, not with the young men who had enforced them. But hardly anyone disputed what Peter's death had come to represent. It showed that a system powerful enough to field rockets and tanks could still be morally bankrupt if it aimed those weapons inward at its own people. Today, if you walk along what used to be the border in Berlin, you can find the place where Peter fell. The metal wall itself is gone, but a metal line in the pavement traces its former path. At the spot where his body lay, there is a simple memorial, a vertical column, a plaque, and the memory of a cross that once stood almost in the shadow of Soviet watchtowers and American observation posts. Tourists take pictures with smartphones that contain more computing power than all the machines used to track the border during the 1960s. They share those images instantly across platforms that connect continents in seconds. And sometimes, as they read the name Peter Fechter, they realize that the struggle playing out in that strip of sand was not just about communism versus capitalism. It was about whether the future would belong to systems that trusted their citizens or to those that feared them. For an American audience, Peter's story lands with a particular weight. The Cold War, especially its early years, was a time of anxiety, duck and cover drills, and talk of missile gaps. But it was also a time when the United States was building the infrastructure of a modern world, highways, universities, research labs, and a space program that many in the East could only watch from behind fences. Every teenager who risked his life to cross the Berlin Wall was casting a vote with his feet in favor of that world. Think about the contrast. On one side, Soviet technicians were indeed launching impressive rockets and putting the first man in orbit. On the other, American engineers and entrepreneurs were wiring together civilian technologies, television networks, mass air travel, consumer electronics that reshaped everyday life. When East Germans tuned into Western broadcasts, legally or illegally, they saw not only government power, but a lifestyle built around mobility and choice. The men in Moscow and East Berlin understood that. They read CIA and State Department analyses, saw Western GDP numbers, and watched American advertising with a mix of anger and fear. They worried not just about American tanks, but about American refrigerators, cars, and college campuses, because deep down they knew that in the long run, the side that people wanted to live in was the side that would win. Peter Fechter never got to live that life. He died in a strip of sand in front of a wall built by men who were afraid of what their own citizens might do if they had access to the same tools, information, and opportunities as their counterparts in the United States. But his story, captured by Western cameras, preserved in court records, and remembered at a simple memorial, continues to speak directly to that larger question. Every time his name is spoken, every time a visitor in Berlin stops to read about him, there is an unspoken comparison happening. On one side, a regime that pointed guns at teenagers trying to move a few hundred meters. On the other, a society that, for all its flaws, invited those teenagers to step into a world of possibilities, powered not by fear, but by innovation and choice. In the early 1960s, as American rockets lit up the sky and mainframes hummed in air-conditioned rooms, it might have been tempting to measure the Cold War purely in terms of megatons and megabytes. But on that August afternoon in 1962, the true measure of the contest was a single wounded boy, a silent line on the map, and two worlds facing each other across a concrete scar. Today, from the vantage point of a 21st century America that helped bring down the wall and then watched Berlin reinvent itself as a united, open city, the story of Peter Fechter feels both distant and familiar. Distant because the concrete and barbed wire have been replaced by bike lanes, cafes, and high-speed internet. Familiar because the questions at its core about freedom of movement, about the responsibilities of powerful states, about what kind of world technology should serve, are still with us. When you hear his story, you're not just listening to a tragedy from a different century. You're hearing an echo of a moment when the values that the United States claimed to stand for, freedom, opportunity, the right to pursue a different life, were put to the test in a very small, very painful way on a Berlin side street. And you're reminded that, in the long run, walls built out of fear cannot compete with societies built around the idea that people should be free to cross them.